Well, thank you so much for coming. I want to thank the folks at Google who always do a great job with food, with AV, with the whole setup, and also everybody at MIT and Solve and MIT Tech Review who also do a fantastic job coordinating this, which is a good amount of work. This is the 5th in our 7 Solve at Google event, and I think this is going to be a really fun and a really eye-opening hour. We've got some tests for you to take, and nothing hard. You don't need to brush up on your calculus or anything. We're going to talk about this idea of uncovering hidden biases, something that all of us have. We like to think we don't. But we do, and how do we think about them, and how do we deal with them as a society? And if you remember, how many of you remember several years ago seeing Sheryl Sandberg's TED Talk about women and women not rising up? So a good chunk of you. And this was really before people sort of knew about this idea of lean in, right, which she went on to write and talk a lot about. But she talked about this idea of women have been in big numbers in the workforce for 40, 50 years. And yet, it doesn't seem like, and you could say this of a lot of other groups as well, like very many CEOs are women. So currently, I think about 95% of Fortune 500 CEOs are men, so not that even. They're not on boards of directors, very often not in corporate suites. What happened? Where did sort of all the intentions go? What were the barriers? So we're gonna look at some of that stuff tonight, and why these barriers arise that we can't even see. We're very lucky to have Mahzarin Banaji, professor of psychology at Harvard, with us. She's one of the real pioneers here in thinking about the idea of blind spots and barriers. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kara.
So let's start right with that. You wrote a book about blind spots. What is a blind spot, like besides the one that exists when we're pulling out of a parking space, and why do we have them?
Right, so we use the term blind spot, and we combine the two words to make it one, to capture exactly the idea of what happens when you're in your car. Your car has a blind spot. When you don't see people who are in it, you run over them. Our minds, we think, are similar, that our minds contain pockets of blind spots, and that when information sits in those blind spots, we can't see it, and we run over people when we are not aware of what sits in that blind spot. So you can think of blind spots as not being aware of information that you might have, that you have accumulated as an ordinary citizen in an ordinary culture who goes around consuming things that are in your environment. Blind spots are also things that affect our behavior, but we don't think they are. So you might even know, oh yeah, I know that there is a cultural sort of stereotype that men are much better at math than women. I know that. But I'm not going to use that when it comes time to choose somebody for my department at Harvard in mathematics. That's not going to affect my decision. And what we are finding is it does. So how is that possible? How can a smart human being even know that such a bias may exist, but somehow not be able to control applying it in a given moment? And that's a very, very interesting question. And Kara and I were just chatting about a line of work that we can call audit studies or resume studies. You might know the resume studies really well because they've become so famous, but you know that you can send exactly the same resume out, but just change one item, the first name of the person. So you can send exactly the same resume out, John Smith and Jane Smith, and then you can sit by the phone in the old days and by your email now and wait for people to call you for this job you've applied for. And you can see how many of the Janes get a call and how many of the Johns get a call, and we know that there is a big difference. We not only know that there's a difference in the general public, in people like myself, faculty members at R1, Research 1 institutions. A bunch of biologists and psychologists at Yale University published a study just a few years ago in which they asked people, who would you hire for this job of lab manager? Now, the lab manager job is a very important job because if you are a lab manager in somebody's lab, you have a much higher likelihood of getting to a better graduate program than if you did not do that job between college and graduate school. So it's a hugely important job. This is in the life sciences mainly, and they find that you send in the same resume, and both men and women selectively hire more men than women. Okay? They offer male candidates $4,000 more in salary, which on a starting salary is non-trivial. It could lead to thousands of dollars of difference by the time you retire. You feel like you want to mentor the male candidate more. And people are puzzled by these data because none of the people who made those choices have an iota of conscious bias. If anything, these are the people who talk about increasing the numbers of women in science. So that's what's so befuddling about the problem at hand and why we must solve this problem.
Well, and also, we'll move from gender. There have been big studies in these resume studies where you change, same resume, and you change the first name to, Kwame or something that feels to the person reading it like it's probably an African American who's applying. And you see differences in callbacks there too.
Right, so my colleague Sendhil Malainathan in the economics department at Harvard and his colleague Marianne Bertrand did the famous race version of this study. And again, you take exactly the same resumes and you just change the first name. It's Larissa or Lakeisha. And you send the resumes out and you see that the callback rates are quite different for exactly the same performance. I love these studies because they're so simple. When you look at the data, you'd have to tell yourself, this is now a no-brainer. Once we know this, how can we do business as usual if we can see that there are systematic differences? The scary study was done by my colleague Deva Pager, where she sent resumes out in New York City, and she discovered, and she changed names to vary in race, and she discovered that if you're a black man, the callback rate that you will get is the same as that of a white man of the same age, same education level, but who also has a felony record. Okay? That's when these two people become equal for a person who's hiring. So when we see evidence like that, we have to ask ourselves, in what way are we going to correct for it? And there are lots of interesting solutions that different corporations are thinking about, including thinking about blinding resumes. So why is it that we need to know anything about a person except what we believe predicts performance on the job? Okay? That's all that we need to know in the first stages. Okay? If you were a symphony orchestra musician, they would need to know nothing about you. They could just put you on a stage, have you play, have you, the audience, decide who's the better musician, and there would be a curtain between you and the player.
Well, and they've actually done this study. I mean, because it used to be in symphonies, and maybe it still is.
It's not a study. It's really how they work now.
Heavily male. People just thought women were just not virtuosos to the same degree, not as good. And then they did a blind study.
Yes. Yeah. So in the late 1970s, American symphony orchestras went through an amazing transformation. I really give them a lot of credit for just thinking that way. Imagine in the late 1970s, you say to yourself, do you think we have a bias? Okay, I don't think other groups were thinking that way. But these people care so deeply about their craft and so much that they should pick the very best violinist that they were willing to think. And by the way, they were not worried about gender, because who cared about gender? They worried that they were picking the musician who may come from the famous person's group. So they worried that if you knew that this kid studied with Stravinsky, that somehow you would listen to the music with a different kind of ear and prefer that person. So they said, well, let's just do blind interviews. And apparently, half of them thought this was a good idea, and the other half laughed and said, this is ridiculous. We know we're not biased. Okay? So I love groups that say, let's experiment on ourselves. Let's test ourselves. So they start to do blind auditions. And symphony orchestras are a very interesting group of people because there's no other industry we know of through such a case study that transformed itself in a very short period of time. In 15 years, American symphonies went from being almost entirely male, with the one little harp player in the corner who would be doing her thing, to all of a sudden becoming deeply gender integrated. So this is striking for many reasons, but it says there was a pipeline. Because when they were asked, why don't you bring more women into the orchestra, the answer always was one that I have given myself many times when asked. I'll say there is no pipeline. Okay? But obviously there was a pipeline. And so I'm here to tell you that when you make such choices, don't think that your memory or your knowledge of the pipeline is actually accurate. You have to actually go to all of those industries from where you're hiring, and you have to know the facts about who's actually coming out with the kind of degrees and the kind of talent that you want, because our brains are really quite behind in knowing what the pipeline even is. Okay? But the remarkable thing about symphony orchestras is that they fixed their problem, but they're lucky. They have only one thing they need to pay attention to, and that's sound. And you can block everything else off, leaving only sound to be heard. And so often you might say, or Kara and I might say to each other, we can't use blind auditions in our kind of work. Eventually you've got to see the person, meet them, how do they communicate is a big part of hiring, and so on. And yet I will tell you that innovative people in organizations are using this to improve their decision making. I was told by the CEO of a Fortune 50 company recently that he was so taken by this idea of the symphony orchestras that he did his succession planning that way. He actually just gave everybody in his organization who was part of the decision-making group blind biographies of the top 100 leaders. And they picked who they thought was the best next CEO based on that. But they didn't know who the person was, just their biographies. They then did it the ordinary way, the usual way. They met and they talked and they went off on a retreat and ate fancy food and they thought about it a lot and they said, what shall we do? And they had time and they brought outside experts and then they made a list. And he called me up to say that these two lists, picked in these two different ways, have not one name in common.
Wow.
Which is striking. Now, it's not clear to me that you must always pick from the blind list or the not blind list, but what I would say is for that group of people to have put themselves through that experience, I think they're going to land in a very good place because they've demonstrated to themselves that they are choosing extremely differently when they know who the person is and when they don't know who the person is. And I think that that's the modern leader. The modern leader cannot shy away from the possibility that their decisions are going to cost their corporation. And that's the reason we should talk about this. Okay? There are many arguments here that are moral arguments about treating people equally and so on. But put those aside for a moment. Assume that that's between you and your God. Now just think about the power of using this kind of social science evidence to improve the quality of the people that we bring in, nurture, and raise to the levels of being leaders in our industries.
You talked about that being the leader of the future. Do you really think when you step back from your own bias of like who you talk to and who is already interested in learning about, do you know what I mean, the research that you've done, do you really think that that is pervasive? Because I would think, no. I would think that the old way of doing things is still what is widely done in all sorts of organizations, be they educational, be they business, nonprofits, whatever.
I was really naive. I would talk to lots of groups of people who would ask me to come teach them about unconscious bias, people in the military, people in governmental agencies, for-profit corporations, universities, and they would say, tell us what the problem is and what. So I would teach a 3-hour seminar in which we would go through one blind spot after another. They would take tests, we would learn about it, and they would say, tell me what to do. I now agree with you. Tell me what to do. So I would say, okay, here are a few things you could do. I would say it's the rare person who actually then does it, which is really perplexing to me because it's pretty obvious in some ways the sorts of things you ought to do. One of the things you have to do that is hard is to give up your discretion. Judges hate this. Judges are handed a book called Sentencing Guidelines, and they're told, if you have somebody before you who has a second time this many ounces of marijuana, you can give them a sentence between X months and Y months. You can pick whatever, but it could be between 3 and 6 months or whatever that number is, but you can't go under that or over that. And judges don't like that because their discretion is being taken away. I'm thrilled that they have sentencing guidelines because I think it has the possibility of wiping out all kinds of other biases that would almost definitely intrude, given just the wealth of the evidence that we see. And these resume-like studies, there are thousands of them. There are not a few of them. Not just with resumes. You can go to a doctor with the same knee problem and ask a doctor whether you need surgery. And based on your gender, you will get very different recommendations. Okay? You can get into a bus and say to a bus driver, I don't have all the change I need today. And you can see what the bus driver tells you to do, except that we train people in these studies to be exactly the same in every way, but they might vary in race, for example. Okay? So these are very interesting studies, and there's so many of them that we can no longer turn a blind eye to them. We can't have a blind spot about our blind spot, is what I would say.
I think some of that, I would guess, that when you tell people things and they don't implement them, it's because they think that other people, this may affect other people, but it doesn't affect them.
Yeah.
And I bet almost all of us sitting here think like, that's terrible. I mean, I can't believe that happens, that women are discriminated against and minorities are not hired at the same rate, but the good thing is I am nothing like that. So I would not make those decisions, and therefore, I don't need those safeguards. But I want to get to one other thing which goes beyond race and gender, which you've pointed out, which is that this does not always necessarily, this kind of bias that we have, does not always discriminate. Is not just limited to race and gender.
Yeah, when you think about this, know that there are some big social categories in our culture that we must focus on, because one group is half the population of the planet. So yes, we must think about that. But don't be taken by the fact that that's where it begins and ends at all. That is to say, these biases are sometimes just old preferences, and they've been given to us by our evolutionary history, by the architecture of how our brains and minds work. And so they're very ordinary in a sense. And so they affect just about everything. So I'll give you a quick little example, if I may. Everybody in this room knows this group of people. There's not one person here who has not heard the name Encyclopedia Britannica. But tell me, when is the last time you opened one? In Kendall Square. Okay. So the interesting thing about Encyclopedia Britannica is that they did have a chance to be opened every single day, because this group of people showed up at the doorstep of the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica in the early 1980s, and they said, we have a new business model for you. Put the encyclopedia into this newfangled thing called software, and you'll make a whole lot more money selling your encyclopedia that way. And the apocryphal story, at least, is that this group of people was ushered out of the CEO's office in under 10 minutes, because he said to them, we've been around for 225 years. We have a great business model. We know exactly what we're doing. So you're all whispering to each other, because who is this group? Microsoft. This is Microsoft Corporation in 1978. There's a young Bill Gates in that bottom left-hand corner. Okay? I want you to put yourself in the mind of the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica, circa 1981, and ask yourself a very simple question. Would you invest in these people? Would you, if I had my laser pointer, I'd point out, would you give $1 of your money to a man with those sideburns in the top left-hand corner? See, I don't think you would have. I don't think I would have. I think we would have done pretty much what that CEO did. But the great thing, when you speak about unconscious biases, you sometimes feel helpless. Like, how are we to correct for things we can't even know we have? But I'm here to tell you that we are a privileged species. We're the only ones on the planet, to our knowledge, who have this incredible capacity to look into our minds, to see what we don't like about ourselves, and to change ourselves. That's the gift of conscious awareness. So to beat the problem of unconscious bias, we must use conscious awareness. And you and I know, we learned that people who look like this are going to make a lot of money someday. We must invest in them. And you do in this part of Cambridge. Right? But your question and mine is not, would we hire people who look like this today? We will. In fact, we'll overhire them, because now we think that people who, who look like that guy with, it's Paul Allen, I think, in the middle. If you look like Paul Allen, that you should immediately hire a person who looks like that, because he's going to sleep on a couch for 5 years and become a billionaire. So I think that's not our problem. Our problem is to imagine, what are we missing today? So that in 40 years, when there is a new but not improved Cara Miller sitting here, and she's interviewing somebody, that they're not looking at the choices we're making today and putting our data up on a slide and sniggering at the fact that we did not get it right. That's our job. That's not a trivial job, but we have the power to go 40 years into the future, to look back at ourselves and just ask the question, what are we doing now that will make us look really silly in 40 years?
When do biases start? I mean, is this something that we learn culturally, or, you know, are little children who are white always biased towards white people because it's just sort of part of their evolution? I mean, you know what I mean? What are we fighting against here?
Yeah, I love that you ask it that way. What are we fighting against? Because I've been for the last 10 years studying young children. And I'll go to any science museum that will let me in, and I will interview every 3-year-old who is willing, in exchange for a little puppet, to talk to me. So one of the things that we've been doing is to look at what we know from the earliest ages. And in thinking about children, just remember that there is no such thing as just societal stuff interfering and causing these, and not just evolutionary stuff. It's always this interplay between the two. So yes, evolution gave us the kind of brain that we have. And it's a brain that evolved in a time when it had to make very quick decisions about who was friend and who was foe. And so it is the case that we are the inheritors of a way of thinking that allows us to rapidly, it's like having compiled programs in our heads that don't need to be reconstituted every single time for efficiency reasons. They will just go into gear and do what is necessary to do in order to live to the next hour. Because that was the charge of the old brain. Live to the next hour, and if lucky, to the next day. Okay. So that brain learned very early on that it is a good idea to move in the direction of those who are like us and away from the ones who are not like us. Difference signaled danger in the old world, and we know that very well, so much so that newborn infants learn within the first month, and by the time they're 3 months old, they show preferences for the skin color of the adults of their group. So Ashkenazi Jewish babies have been shown by 3 months to show a preference for people who have light skin over dark skin. Ethiopian Jews in Ethiopia, their babies show the exact opposite preference for dark skin over light skin. But, and this is the lovely thing about culture, Ethiopian babies who moved to Israel and have caregivers of both skin colors show no bias. Okay? So this is a lovely example of both, of an initial and innate tendency to prefer others of our kind, and then the kind then depends. What is the kind around us? And so we've been struck by the result we have that from a very early age, on our kinds of tests of blind spots, on our kinds of tests of automatic ways in which the mind just goes off and thinks in a certain way without asking our permission, that on tests like that, 3-year-olds look just like adults. That the bias the adult in a culture has, a 3-year-old reflects that almost perfectly. They're like little mirror images of what we show as adults.
So if you push that up to adults and you go back to what we were talking about, does that mean that people who tend to be discriminated against, if they were the people in charge, would they show preferences for their own group? You know, I mean, do women also believe that women aren't good at math, or do women think, no, women, they're pretty good at math? I mean, you know what I mean? How much do they differ from how men think about women and math?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question because we have known all along that we like those of our kind. So how does that then lead to the result that men and women seem to be equally biased in favor of men on the job? Okay? I think that we have mistaken 2 different dimensions and collapsed them into one in our minds. We think that if we like people, we will hire them. But liking is just one dimension, the degree to which I feel warmth towards you in the front row. That, I think, is a function of our similarities and so on. But there is another dimension on which we evaluate people, and that's a dimension of what I'll call competence or respect. And in our culture, we don't tend to give both to any individual group or person. Okay? CEOs, Asians, feminist women, these are people who are respected but not loved. Mothers, grandmothers especially, the homeless, migrant workers, people like that, they are liked. You think you have pity or liking for them, but not respect for them. Okay? So these are very interesting dimensions that get traded off. And on gender, women score high on worth and men on competence. Okay? But all of this leads to the basic question that Kara is asking. Can members of a particular group discriminate against their own kind? And the answer is absolutely. Okay? So we've seen this in the gender data. That's most obvious when it's on the job, not who's your friend. If you ask people, who do you want as your friend, women will pick women. So when you ask about liking, that's not going to matter. But when it is, who do you think has talent, then both men and women have the same thumbprint of the same culture on their brains. And they therefore act out in very similar kinds of ways.
Mm-hmm. So we want to give people a couple tests and then go to your questions. And the test that you're going to get a chance to take is this thing called the IAT, the Implicit Association Test. And you have taken it. I have taken it. How many people here have taken one of these tests? Oh, a few people, not too many, a few people. It can be a frightening experience. Mahzarin, I think it was a frightening experience for you, right?
Oh,
you've written about
it was the worst day of my life.
So get ready. No,
so, this one is fun.
So
yes.
Explain what this test is.
Okay, so I think that I could explain what the test is endlessly, and I have to do that when I write a paper. But the great thing about having a live audience is I can just have you take a test, and you will learn immediately what this is. So I thought, what could I make? How could I make a test that will show you, first of all, that we all have preferences, and many of them are totally fine for us to have. You come from the great city of Boston or Cambridge. For you to love the Red Sox and hate the Yankees is a perfectly good preference for you to have. You should not change this preference. You might even want to grow this preference because it is a good preference to have. A love for your own child over the neighbor's child. Within legal limits, that's a perfectly good preference for you to have. A love of your own company or the place you work for over the rival. That's what gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you to work. Have a bit of a preference for your own over the rival one. So there are lots of preferences we have that are things you should be aware of, but I don't think they're a problem. Because for every Red Sox fan, there are 10 more Yankee fans. It all works out. Where we worry is, of course, well, we don't want to have these preferences and we still have them. So the first test you're going to take is a new one. I have not tried this test on any group before, but I thought it would be very timely. I want to know about your preference for Clinton versus Trump. So we're going to take a Clinton-Trump test.
The perfect place to take it, Cambridge, Massachusetts.
I know. I'm told that I'm in the People's Republic of Cambridge and that I should expect the data to veer in one direction rather than another. But I'm here to tell you, whether you are a Clinton supporter or a Trump supporter in this room, just know that there is nothing wrong with having a preference for your candidate. This is a free country. So here we go. We're going to take a test in which we'll see which one you like. And what's interesting is that in this case, the test will tell you pretty much what you already know, but you will see that you're unable to even control your bias or your preference in this case. A bias in this case is nothing more than the preference. So the way the test works is this. A face or a word will show up in the middle of the screen. If it belongs to Donald Trump, you will say left very quickly. If it belongs to Clinton, you will say right very quickly. And by very quickly, I mean very quickly. 680 milliseconds to respond, okay? So what is that? That's somewhere between a half a second and a second. So you'll say left, right, left, right. Okay, so you're going to do that. You have to do that fast, and you have to go so fast.
Donald Trump is left.
Yeah, because on the screen, you look, Kara, you can do it, but you can do it by looking.
Got it.
Donald Trump is a left, and Hillary is a right. And what you have to do is not only answer fast, you have to go so fast that it's okay to make some mistakes. So if occasionally you say left instead of right, that's fine. Don't stop. Pick up the next item and go. And the third rule is belt it out. Just do it nice and loudly so you get a feeling for how you're doing. Okay? So let's try this. Say left loudly for Trump, right loudly for Clinton. Oh, sorry, yeah, exactly. So left for Trump and right for Clinton. And oh, you'll see photos and a couple of signatures and logos from their websites. So anything that's Trump related, say left. Anything that's Clinton related, say right. Ready, go.
Right. Left. Right. Right. Left. Right. Left. Right. Left.
OK, that's a Donald Trump signature. OK. All right. So you were pretty good, but you were a little slow, slower than I would like. So on the next round, you're going to go super fast and tell me. Now you're going to see words that mean good and bad things. If you see a good word, a word like love, peace, joy, friend, sunshine, success, say left. If you see a bad word, a word like devil, bomb, war, vomit, awful, failure, you will say right. And don't become philosophical and say, but which war did you mean, professor? Just say right if it's a bad thing, OK? So left for good things, right for bad things, nice and loud and fast. Right, 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 left, 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 right, left. Excellent. Woo, we're getting there. That's very good. OK, so 690 is good. All right. Now, this is what you have to do. So which way do you want to try? Do you want to do Hillary Clinton good first? Or do you want to do, oh, let's do it this way. All right, so now if you see a Trump face or signature or anything, or if you see a good word, I'd like you to say left. If you see a Clinton face or word, or if you see something terrible, you're going to say right, OK? Let's see how fast you can go. Ready? Go. Right. So you are pretty pathetic at doing this. And I'm going to give you, so we won't even do this again. We'll just move on. And you'll do a quick little switch. So let's try this version, OK? So now this is just practice. Now you just learn to switch these two and say left for Clinton and right for Trump. Ready? Go. Left, left, right, right, left, right, right, left, left, right, left, right. Excellent. Ooh, I love that score. So let's see if we can go just as fast now. All right. Now, if it's Hillary or good, say left. If it's Trump or bad, say right. Ready? Go. Left, right, right, left, 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 right, 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 left, right, 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 left, 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 right, left, left, right. Do you know how big this difference is, statistically speaking? You don't need a computer to measure this. A sundial would tell us that you prefer the one over the other, okay? So think about this in this room. It was a no-brainer, as a neuroscientist would say, for you to associate Clinton with good rather than Trump with good. You already, it's possible that for those of you who showed this bias, I would say, that you already know that of the two, if I asked you, tell me, who do you prefer, you would have said Clinton over Trump, let's say. What's interesting is that you were not trying to go slow in the Trump good case that you got earlier, okay? You were not trying to go slow. You could not go fast because that is not a practiced response for you. For you, Trump and good have never co-occurred in your minds. Okay? Those two have not come together. And so your brain has to go searching for where they are and has to put them together, okay? And that might also happen when you have to associate dark-skinned people with good. It may be hard to do because it is not a practiced response. So let's not worry about that one. This is a fun test to take because it doesn't tell you anything that you don't already know. I'm going to give you one more test that I'd like you to take. And let's see, we'll take it in the opposite order of this one. And let's see how it goes. This is an especially easy test because names of men and women are so easy to categorize that you're going to just whip through this. If you see an ordinary Judeo-Christian name like John or David, please say left. If you see a name like Susan or Jennifer, say right, okay? This is easy. You know the drill. Go fast, go loud. It's okay to make a few mistakes, but don't stop. Just keep going. Ready? Go.
Right, left, right, 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 left, 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 right, left, right, left.
Amazing. Now that score is so amazing, it beats the speed of sound. Okay, now here we go. You're going to see words that come from two different categories. These are both good things. We love our life at home and want to be good people in our home spheres, and then we want to be good people in our careers. So if you see a word like, I'm just picking generic things, so manager, job, salary, profession, office, desk, boardroom, things like that. If you see those words, say left. If you see a home word, house, family, children, marriage, kitchen, cooking, cleaning, anything like that, you will say right. All right, ready? Left for career, right for family, go fast.
Left, right, right, left, left, right, right, left, right, left, right.
Excellent, very good. And now let's do this version first. If you see a male name, like John, or a career word, like job, say left. If you see a female name like Susan or a home word like children, say right. Ready? Go.
Right, left, left, right, right, left, 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 right, right, left, right, left, right, right, left, right, left, right, right.
Amazing. Remember the number 651. Okay? Because we're going to come back and compare something else to it. And now let's just jump right into this version of it. Okay? All right. Say left for female or career. I even have a hard time putting the two together. All right. Say left for female or career and right for male and home. Ready? Go fast.
Right, right,
Oh is the right word. You are lucky I didn't count your errors. I only counted speed, okay? Because if you put those two together, speed and accuracy, you should get a pretty reliable score that over time will stay roughly the same if you keep measuring yourself. Unless, of course, if you choose to do some interventions in your life and if you decide that you're going to beat the test. So I flunk this test, and I fail it at a rate even worse than you do because on average you are younger than me. And the younger you are, the less of this bias you show. So young people then say to me, well, then all we have to do is wait for old people like you to die, and there will be no bias. And I say, not so fast. There are many groups that you know about that are meaningful to you, where you will have your own set of biases that I wouldn't have because I can't even tell those two groups apart, and you can. But more interestingly, if this test has changed, that is, I don't know if it's changed, but certainly we know that kids who are younger show less bias on this test than people who are older, and it has a nice pattern. It's literally just decade by decade. The older you are, the more of this bias you show, and I think it's a reflection of the world we live in. My students see people like me in the classroom. I never did. So that accounts for why this has changed. But it doesn't mean that, therefore, young people are free of bias on everything. Especially on race, where they think they're so cool that they are different, we see that if the test involved dark-skinned and light-skinned faces instead of these male and female names, and you had to associate them with good and bad words of the kind that you did in that first test, that young people show exactly the same level of bias as elderly people do. That hasn't changed. Race bias in our country is pretty much the same whether you're 6-year-old or 80 years old. And that's a very interesting and troubling kind of question to ask. Why? And I think it is just as with gender. It's changing because the world is changing. Yes, Kara is right that there are very few women CEOs, but everybody's mother packs her lunch and goes out to work, or most people's mothers do that. And so the idea of women in the workplace is something that we have come to know. But on race, on the question of do we like people who are from a group that is not our own, we don't see much of a change at all. And I think that's because we live largely separate lives. That's my theorizing, at least, that race, given everything, in housing segregation, but even job segregation and so on, that we encounter race in the newspapers, even on the street, but we walk past each other knowing that that's another person and that people of that skin color have certain kinds of jobs and people of my skin color have other kinds of jobs, or whatever it might be. And I think until that really changes, until friendships, deep friendships and intimacy crosses racial lines, I think this test will continue to reveal that there is no change.
I'll just throw one more thing at you, which is, you know, you talked about people becoming friends or even, you know, marrying people of a different race. There's a fascinating story that you've told before about Malcolm Gladwell, whose mother is from Jamaica, I think, and he took the implicit association test, and it showed a slight preference against black people. And he was like horrified. I mean, he said, it's just horrifying to me that the person I love most in the world, I'm showing a bias against. I mean, it wasn't her specifically, of course, but he certainly, it troubled him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, and that's so tricky. I mean, that gets to that issue of culture, what we see in the media, what that teaches us, and that, boy, it's hard, no matter how diverse in some ways your life is, it's really hard to transcend very pervasive ideas.
Yeah, and I would say he's actually lucky because he's biracial, and biracial people tend to be less biased because they have gotten two things that our culture thinks of as opposites of each other in their own selves. And which is why I always think that maybe Barack Obama is probably our least biased on race president, not because he's black, as he says, but because he's biracial. That may be a big part of these. So when people like Malcolm Gladwell honestly speak about this, I think they're doing us a huge service. That it is very hard for a public personality like him to actually go on the Oprah Winfrey show and talk about this bias. But I think that we cannot do anything less than that. That is something that each of us has to. It took me a very long time to stand up in front of an audience and tell about the first day I took this test in '95 or so and discovered my own bias. It was a life-changing day. I have never been the same since that day. It's a very important moment. And yet, there are a lot of people who don't want to know. You know, I think I always ask them, if you had a tumor in your eye, would you want to know about it? Or would you rather not know about it? And their answer is an obvious answer. Of course I want to know about it so I can do something about it. And I say, I rest my case. Yeah.
Okay, we got a bunch of questions over here. First one.
Yes.
Hi. Sorry. First of all, I'd like to thank you for bringing this conversation to us this evening. It's actually very timely. I'm just became a manager at a small startup. We make augmented reality simulations. And a friend of mine had me take one of these tests, especially the workplace one.
I love the had me take the test.
Well,
yes.
she encouraged me
okay.
to. And actually, my mother was the breadwinner when I grew up, and I found a bias towards women in the workplace.
So meaning you associate female with career?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And I kind of looked at how I work and how I work the best with women, actually. And I wonder if that's something I actually need to be careful of, as well as, and sorry, this is a few questions, but how do we also, if we are able to achieve a consciousness about our bias, like we know that it's there, but we can do good things about it, how do we scale that? How do we scale that within organizations, within communities, to actually be more inclusive, to be more conscious? And then the last part is when we're starting new companies, when the team is only 2 people, 3 people, when you really need to associate with that person, what do we do with our biases if it's that uncomfortable, or if it's that, you know, how do we prepare for that? Or I don't know. It's kind of like throw your hands up at that. But thank you.
Yeah, a lot of questions and all wonderful questions. First of all, look, you are one of those lucky people, I would say, because you are bucking the cultural trend in the data that you obtain on the test. So 75% of men who take this gender career test show the effect we saw in the room, but 25% of men do not. 15% are neutral. They're equally fast in the 2 cases. And 10% of men are like you. They actually tilt a little bit in the direction of associating female with career more than male with career. We don't know who you weird people are, but we are very glad you are around, okay? So this is, and why do I say I'm glad? Because what's to say? There's nothing like a passing or failing score on this test. There's only one measure of success or failure on this test, and that is, where would you like to be? That's it. There is no other standard. Where would you like to be? And I can speak honestly about myself and say, I would like to be equal. I actually don't want to show a preference one way or the other. I would like to be neutral, smack down the middle. And I'm not, okay? So you are right. If I were you, I would use these tests much like you would use other diagnostic tests and saying, you probably don't need to spend a lot of your time worrying about this. First of all, make sure that you take the test a few different times and that the score comes out the same, okay? So take the average of a few different tests. But if the test comes out the way it does, and by the way, there are tests that you will each of you, if you take a whole variety of them, you will find yourself every now and then elated that you're not showing a bias that the rest of your culture does. And that will lead you to ask the question, why? So it forces you to ask, like, what should I be spending my time on? I have to work on other biases, not that one, because for whatever reason, my culture gave me something that's the opposite. And I think your last question, which is a very hard question, what do we do? I think be aware. So when symphony orchestras went to blind auditioning, one of the pieces of the story that's never told is that they did not do so well in terms of how they felt about themselves. My colleague Richard Hackman actually was studying symphony orchestras when all this was happening, and he discovered in the data something you don't want to see. You want to see data that show that when you bring diverse people together, it all works out and everybody is happy and they're making great music together. Not at all. Orchestras believed that they were falling apart, that they were not cohesive, that they weren't playing well anymore. And as the number of women is increasing in symphony orchestras, the orchestras are feeling more and more terrible about themselves. Okay? So I want you to be prepared for that. Because you tell yourself, yes, there's that old brain. It's going to want a certain way of doing things that feels like it used to be. And especially in moments when the economy crashes, when the world seems unstable, that's when we want to run back to people of our kind and hang with them. This hunkering down feeling that I think is being caused, we're seeing this in the country now. Those are the moments of those are the test moments for us. In that moment, so I think when you start a new group, you should tell them, we're all very different from each other. You speak French and I speak English, and we're going to have to, make augmented reality work. But we think this will cause us some trouble, because when you say X, I will think Y. We'll just work through that. But acknowledging it, putting it on the table, will ultimately lead to a benefit that you cannot achieve with homogeneity, and we know that.
So we don't have too long left. So
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I'm going to do 2 questions at a time. So I'll take your question and then throw them both at you.
Okay.
And maybe they'll overlap.
So when you were talking about taking the bias test and then feeling really bad that you had the results that you had, and then why people don't want to confront this in themselves. Like, I definitely understand, like, not wanting to feel bad about yourself about being biased. But then if you start to unravel that even further, like if you're a white man taking this test and you realize that across the board you get certain privileges that other people don't get because you are a white man, what does that mean in terms of them then having to think about how they got the opportunities that they got in life. And then how do you deal with, like, if we're talking about a whole culture and society having to deal with this issue, like, how do you tell people that who have power and achievement that actually they didn't get that power and achievement just because of their own intelligence and abilities, that it had a lot to do with other things. And so I'm just curious about, in terms of solutions, how do you get at that complexity of having people start to consider the fact that maybe their accomplishments are not so great if other things were equal?
Okay, and then let's take this one too.
Well, mine's maybe similar, which is pointing out people's failings isn't necessarily going to motivate them to change it. I know that from being married a long time, but also, you know, a project I did trying to get people to stop texting and driving. You can show people any amount of evidence of why that's bad, but ingrained behaviors, and this seems even more ingrained because it's like genetic and beliefs, I mean, all wrapped up into one. You know, what's the other side of pointing out someone's bias? If they're not a hiring manager, I get that, but just in day-to-day life, how does it play out?
Well, there are many things that were ingrained in us that we changed. We don't hang from trees. We build homes. We have indoor plumbing, for heaven's sake. These were not things that were ingrained in us. We weren't born to build indoor plumbing. But we did it because we set our minds to it and we said, I want a better way of life. I want something better for me and my children. And we did it. And just think about little things that have seemed so hard to do. I used to never wear a seatbelt. I grew up in India. We didn't even have seatbelts. And to put on a seatbelt took a lot of work. It now is second nature to me. How is it that I just do it now? And it seemed impossible 25 years ago. These are, so I can give you thousands of things, examples of this species that we do. None of those behaviors came naturally to us. None of them were easy. And yet we now do them pretty automatically because at some point, individual minds changed, laws changed, policies changed to all make it go in a direction that's opposite of the natural one. So I have great hope that this will be another stage like that. And I'm also seeing large numbers of organizations taking this challenge and working these into their policies. How do we set it up so that we don't even make that mistake, so we don't have to correct for it in some other way? Think about organ donation. You know, we used to ask people to mail a postcard in if they wanted to donate their organs, instead of saying, mail this postcard in if you do not want to donate your organs. And you can change percentages from 4% donation to 99% donation, right? So these are all ways in which we can produce behaviors in ourselves and in others that we all agree are actually in our interest as a society. But I take your point that it is not easy, and that you need practice of a deep sort.
Question, that first question, does it involve making sure that people in a group that's privileged feel like they are, or feel that, you know, do they have to come to the realization that maybe not everything I got I deserved? Or, I mean, that doesn't feel like something that a lot of people are going to want to think about. Or believe about themselves.
But we do all the time. There were a group of people in this very region of the country calling themselves abolitionists. And they said, there are privileges we have that other people should have. There are people who've done that routinely through history, but it is not easy. And identifying privilege is a very hard thing to do.
What we're going to do for the last question is all three folks who are standing, you can ask your questions, and then we'll just pick through them in a question extravaganza. You want to start? And we'll go over here.
So my question is more of a perceived bias as a minority. A lot of times these studies that have been shown, it talks about how a majority group has perceived bias towards a minority group or underrepresented group. And as a woman of color in a predominantly office of white people, sometimes I wonder if I have a perceived bias towards them. I don't know if they're gonna like reprimand me or talking to me, if they're like, if it's coming from a place where they think because I'm black and I'm a woman, I don't know if I'm already exhibiting a perceived bias towards what I think is going to be the response. And so I don't know if, I know there's a lot of studies
Sure.
that start the other end, but how does that play out in terms of a
Yeah.
minority group having perceived bias towards a majority group?
Sure. And I think that's a very interesting question, because in all of these ways, these are kind of two-way streets. And what you're talking about is what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? To what extent are you setting yourself up in certain ways by answering the question, by assuming that the question was meant to ask you about X rather than Y, so that the answer that you give is in fact confirming whatever it is the other person might already be thinking. So these are extremely interesting questions, and I think we need to talk about them at both ends. I think we talk a lot more about the majority group, the group, not majority statistically, but the more powerful groups, because I guess we think rightly that they need to think about what that is. But I would not for a moment let up on what you're thinking about as well, and I often say this to young women. And I want to tell you that today we've spoken largely about the side of the perceiver. How do I, as the perceiver of another human, how do I bring my own beliefs and preferences to bear on thinking about them? But I very much feel that it is members of disadvantaged groups who also are costing themselves. I can give you examples. I heard from an academic department elsewhere that they were trying to hire somebody in a particular field, and they noticed that this is a field with many women, but the women were not rising to the top at all, so they were interviewing larger numbers of men in a field that had 50% women, and they were perplexed by that. So they slowed down their search process. They wrote to the leaders of the field, and they said, who are the young people who we should be thinking about in this field? And they got names, and those names consistently mentioned 6 people, all of whom happened to be women. None of them were in the pool. So they were called and asked, and to a T, they all said exactly the same thing. I didn't think I belonged there. I remember that your advertisement said that you were seeking exceptional candidates, and I didn't think of myself as exceptional. Okay? When they discovered that they were in the top 5% of the pool and they just hadn't applied, they were stunned. Okay? And people like me, older women like me, say to these young women, how can you not apply? If you don't apply, how can we hire you? And so on. But I did exactly that. When I was 26-year-old, I did not apply for the first job I got, which was a job at Yale University. My husband mailed my CV in. Because I lived on the West Coast, he lived on the East Coast, we were trying to live together, there was a job at Yale, and he thought, you should apply. And I said to him, they'll never hire me, I'm not gonna apply. Okay? But they called me up and said, we have your CV, but no supporting materials. And I said to him, you rascal, you sent my CV in? And yes, he did. So look, not all of us are lucky enough to be married to feminist men who will mail resumes on our behalf. You have to mail it yourself. All right.
So let's take the last 2
Yeah.
together.
I'm wondering if your research illuminates any dangers. I'm here because, I support overcoming bias. I've been a gay activist, the whole bit. I'm not claiming I'm perfect, but I'm in favor of all of this. But I'm also watching the political scene where we've got Trump rising, we've got, all these reactions against the Supreme Court decision on gay marriage and all this stuff. So I guess the question is, how do we move towards this goal while still being aware that there are these innate tendencies that could cause a backlash?
Mm-hmm. And let's hear the last question and take them together.
You've obviously studied lots of different biases in lots of different groups of people. I'm just wondering if there's one or two that you found the most interesting or the most surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got backlash and then surprising biases.
I think on the backlash question, every activist asks that question, everybody who's interested in social change of any kind. And I've been so deeply troubled by the situation now and how we came to it that I have been reading about the Weimar Republic in order to understand how things were and why that moment. And I just learned just a lot about similar kinds of things when societies go through periods where they break out of older molds of doing things and they embrace a newer way, there are tendencies in the same society that don't want that and do pull back. And I don't see an alternative to continuing to talk across the aisle, even though it becomes really hard. And as an academic, I worry a little bit that my environments end up becoming so homogeneous in the way we think that we become shocked when we see things. That how could this happen? Well, if maybe I interacted with people a little different than me, I would have known exactly this is going to happen. So I would like to argue that it is my job to constantly be searching for new ways to understand our minds. That's my job. I'm paid to do that. And that when I discover things, that I should report on them. Everything has a downside. Even a discovery of an AIDS virus. I'm told some people said, well, we should not be discovering them because some people will use them to ill. Yes, it's possible that in the hands of a terrorist, an AIDS vaccine could do some harm. So anything good, anything you build, anything you do is going to provoke a reaction of some sort. But my feeling is that if we can understand where people are coming from when they say things that to us sound horrendous, then sit down and keep on talking about it, that it will change minds. That's been the enterprise for the last. We put these tests on a website in 1998, and I wouldn't say there was a backlash, but certainly there was something. I mean, we got thousands and thousands of emails. Some of them pretty scary. Some of them from right-wing groups who said we're targeting your lab. But mostly what we got was just, and this is one of the earlier questions said, when you try to teach people something that they don't want to learn. I've been actually impressed with the modal response. The modal response is, damn, I didn't know this about myself. I'm going to try to think about it. I'm going to fix it in some way. And then I get these lovely little messages. You may remember me because I wrote you, and I hate to tell them I can't remember you because there are 17 million of you who have written. But they'll say, I discovered this, and now I do it this way. Now I make sure that I have a picture of my board so I actually know where people are sitting, and I write down what they say because it has been pointed out to me that I don't hear the questions from certain kinds of people. So I now do this to fix it. This is very encouraging to me that human beings also have a great desire to improve. Okay? And I have to count on that desire to improve.
And then in the last minute, a couple, any biases that you've seen that have really surprised you, that certain kinds of people against other kinds of people, or for other kinds of people, or?
Here's a surprising one. All right, so you give people a test in which you give them American symbols and foreign symbols, and you have them associate them with people who are Asian, of Asian origin, and people who have European origin. And you find that even if you tell them that these Asians are 10th generation Asians and these Europeans are 10th generation Americans, both are 10th generation Americans, that the association of Asian as foreign and European faces as American is pretty strong. Okay? So when you ask people, why do you think this bias? And they laugh at themselves when they take this test because they know the right answer. They've just been told these Asians are all American and have lived here their whole lives, and so did their great-great-grandparents and so on. So when they take the test and their fingers are not able to associate Asian with American symbols, they just laugh because they can see that their brain is not doing what it ought to be doing. But when you ask them, they'll say, well, the reason this bias happens is because Asians came to this country later. So we have a view of the first, and Europeans came here first. So we said, oh, OK, then let's give them a European Native American test. That was my favorite one to turn the screw. And of course, on that test too, and by the way, we work very hard not to produce a biased result on the test by giving them American symbols like the dollar bill and the Washington Monument, because those are symbols of white America. So we actually give them symbols that are easier to associate with Native people, natural scenes, famous monuments that are all natural, and allowing the association to go both ways, but it massively associates European with American rather than Native people. And that's an interesting power, and I have wondered if that test actually is telling us something about, at least in the past, the people who we thought were traitors to the United States happen to have names like Sacco and Vanzetti, or the Rosenbergs. Okay? And I wonder if being not from the group that is considered the classic prototypic American, made people. And Wen Ho Lee was an interesting case to me, because Wen Ho Lee was a nuclear physicist at Los Alamos Labs who'd been accused of having sold American nuclear secrets to the Chinese government. And there were 54, I think, indictments. And he was absolved of all of them, but one which had to do with him having transferred some files from a computer to another one that he shouldn't have, but which everybody in the office did. And so why did that happen? Like, why did the FBI become suspicious of Wen Ho Lee? They didn't have anything personally against him. These were not people we would call consciously biased. They weren't going after all Asian. But something about Wen Ho Lee made them feel like, yeah, you know, he could be doing this. Would it have been the same had the name been Robert E. Lee instead of Wen Ho Lee? I don't think so. I think that that it just feels right when that association fits. And those are the moments in which the conscious mind has to become our guardian. It has to be the one that says, stop and look. Would you do it this way? You know, what are the privileges I have experienced that may not be visible to me, and so on. And that's an endless search. And as somebody said, you know, the farthest star from us is ourselves.
I want to thank you all so much for coming. Thanks to the YouTube audience who are listening live stream. And a version of this will be up in just a couple of days. So if you want to see it or if you want to share it or whatever, you most certainly can. If you just look for the Solve at Google Talks, you'll see all the previous ones in addition to this one. So thank you so much. And thanks mostly to Mahzarin and the great tests.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.